So do you see my screen, Artem?
Yes, everything is perfect. Yeah, we see the presentation.
Perfect. So we are ready to start. My name is Magdalena Rzaca and I am GDPR and IPR legal advisor and I work at Giant Association. Before Giant, I was advising in commercial companies on privacy and intellectual property issues. And I will be talking today about data protection at the time of COVID-19. This is, I think, very hot topic nowadays. And today I will just start from setting up the context. Then I will discuss privacy requirements, also discuss certain solutions, and then there will be time for questions. But I also encourage you to ask questions during my presentations. So 2020 brought us unprecedented challenge. We are having this conference in online form. Meanwhile, normally it would take place in real life. And we cannot travel. We are confined in our countries, regions, and everything due to one very bad virus with COVID-19, and it was declared by World Health Organization as a global pandemic back in March. And we are already in May, and we are still feeling the results of this unfortunate event. And as COVID-19 is influencing extremely much on our reality, there are more than 4 million cases globally. There are many deaths. More than 172 countries are impacted by COVID-19, many individuals, many tragedies. That is providing a specific challenge for governments and research institutions to provide a response to solve this situation. And as a response, what is visible in media coverage is a trade-off that we should sacrifice our privacy for public health. This is depicted like a dilemma that we need to choose one thing because we cannot have both. In my opinion, this dilemma is based on misconception, on false incompatibility between those two issues. Also on the lack of the trust to the citizens. If we need to choose, it means that our legal framework is not flexible enough to protect both. And there is another, if we will renounce from privacy in order to protect public health, there is another risk that one solution that should be just temporary will be then permanently with us, collecting a huge amount of data about us and used for many other purposes than just fighting COVID-19. Of course, at the forefront of this fight with the COVID-19 is the preparation of application tracking contact between individuals, and it shall be highlighted just at the beginning of any discussion that the success of such application is based on the fact that in the first place people have smartphones. Those smartphones are also quite new. They have to have specific specifications. That also brings a challenge for elderly people, or let's say for disadvantaged environments where people simply cannot afford a phone. And then another issue is that at least more than 60% of population shall use that application. Other experts highlight that it should be more than 60, around 80% of the population. So I think taking into account that not everyone have or want to have a smartphone, this is a challenge in itself. Then there is another challenge connected with internet access, that coverage, it's not equal for different world regions. And of course, in Africa, there is much less coverage than, for example, in Europe or in North America, and then in USA is more the coverage than in, for example, in Canada. For the applications that are using GPS signal, there is issue that this GPS signal is not very accurate, especially in cities where there is high density of the buildings. And there is another side of this coin. Using GPS also brings risk that any other data will be connected with those locations data and will prepare vulnerable profiles. Any app can also provide false positives and false negatives, and I will just follow on that in a moment. And I think also any application can provide like false sense of security to citizens, in the sense, oh, we have applications, so we don't have to worry. Unfortunately, any app that will be used for COVID-19 fight will be used as additionally measure, because in the first place we need to wash our hands and keep the distance, and then just for the people that simply cannot have this social distance, and for example need to take metro to go to work, and then during the metro ride they will find other people, then subsequently will be diagnosed with COVID. They can take some special steps and take a test if necessary. And there is a very good example of a positive false positives. It was in case of Israel application, which use also GPS, which is not very accurate in the terms that GPS is not taking into account the physical borders, that it's a building or it's not a building. And as a result, whole house complex of buildings, everyone who was living in this building was sent to quarantine, because there was one individual living in a separate flat without having any contact with other people. So this is another, let's say, not so bright side of technology that should be also taken into account when any application is developed. So I would suggest that we will talk about public health and privacy, because those fundamental rights shall be protected and especially protected in emergency situations that we are facing now. Moreover, our legal framework is flexible enough to provide solutions and for public health and preserve privacy at the same time. And moreover, specifically, general data protection regulations envisage processing of health data, which is specific, sensitive kind of data. And such processing is possible on the basis of consent. Of course, for consent, there are very specific requirements. It must be freely given, informed, and it must be affirmative action. And there are also another part of consent, as it must be as easy to withdraw as to give it. So it's not so simple to rely on, but also there is another provision that allows to process the data on the basis of European Union or member state law provisions for public health purposes. So we have the tools to accommodate both public health and privacy. And if we are talking about data protection, unfortunately, we don't have one global standard of global protection. And as we see, with the red color are the countries that they are having heavy privacy regime, including, of course, Europe, that we have the most famous general data protection application. Then with orange, there are countries with robust application, including China. With yellow, there are countries with moderate privacy regime, including Russia. And there are other countries with limited, very limited privacy protection, as for example, India. And as we see, there are many countries that they are not having any data protection regime as far. And to that, we also need to add additional challenge of data localization laws that, for example, in Russia, if you are processing data of Russian citizens, you need to store the data in Russia. So those are specific requirements that application developers need to take into account when they will be developing solutions. As COVID-19 caught us without any, let's say, any warning, even though there was a warning, there was a time that it was known that something is happening. But as a result, data protection authorities around the world prepared responses how to process the data, or what we should expect what we should pay attention to. And there is a really good website that all the guidelines are collected. But those guidelines are mostly focused on employment aspects, and I will not focus because this is completely different side of this problem. And European Commission in April called for pan-European approach to combat and exit from the COVID-19 crisis, in particular concerning mobile applications and the use of anonymized mobility data. And the European Commission prepared a set of recommendations, including that any application shall, of course, be prepared in GDPR compliance rules, shall be implemented in cooperation with health authorities, shall be voluntary, not obligatory, and of course shall end its life cycle after when it's no longer needed. EC also recommended that Bluetooth will be used, which is less invasive than GPS. Of course, recommended anonymized data, and highlighted the need of interoperability across the European Union, and I think this is the biggest challenge now. Of course, such applications shall reflect epidemiological, cybersecurity, and accessibility guidance, and also very important part that it should ensure security, which is not so straightforward. So I would just open a very good website which is providing a very good overview of all the applications that are used globally. And we can see just in Europe, we have at least 4 different pan-European coalitions. And then we see that different countries, they have already different applications. In Netherlands, we have Private Tracer. In Austria, we have Stop Corona. In Germany, we have Corona data spent. In Iceland, we have a government app project. And I could just list all of them, but that's not the point. The point is that definitely there is no consistency. And as European Commission yesterday mentioned that is recommending to the governments, to the countries, that the life will be going back to normal, which means also that the traveling will be happening soon, but of course gradually. That brings questions how application that is just for the Netherlands will be compatible with the Spanish one or with the Italian one, and how individuals traveling from different regions, they can ensure that any COVID risk is tracked. Another issue, another problem with the application is that some of them are encouraging decentralized approach and others centralized, which means that for decentralized, that there is no one big data set, and it's just in case of let's say, positive, if one user is diagnosed with COVID and then is just retracing back to the people that could have been in contact with this individual. Meanwhile, for example, in France, in UK, there is a centralized model, which means that there is one big authority where storing the data. Of course, each of this approach brings a little bit different privacy security issues, but both of them require appropriate security measures to be in the place. Because, for example, centralized model is very, I think, tasty for hackers, as they can easily, if there is no enough security, they can easily get access to very sensitive data. And among the decentralized approach, there is, of course, Apple and Google decided to cooperate for this, for COVID fight, which I think it's very good, but also brings a lot of security questions. As part of, as COVID-19 is, of course, in the at heart of all the institutions, also European Data Protection Board issued guidelines on the use of location data and contact tracing tools. European Data Protection Board is basically a body that is consisting of all the data protection authorities from European Union. And European Data Protection Board highlighted that measures shall be necessarily limited, of minimal extent, and subject to periodic and genuine review, as well as to scientific evaluation. And also that no one should choose between public health and privacy. We should have them both. So if we are talking about any application that will be processing personal data, which means personal data is basically any data that can be can lead to identification directly or indirectly an individual, for example, phone number, but also less obvious data, like, for example, IP address. Processing means any action that is taken on the data. So if there will be any personal data processed in the app, such app shall be transparent, which means that it should be clear for the user which data and for what purposes will be used. Shall be also in line with purpose limitation, which means that the app is used only, the data in the app is only used for COVID tracking and not, for example, for profiling. Because, for example, if someone is diagnosed with COVID, which means that it can be more prone to be unemployed or have some financial problems. So then can be all this, let's say, Pandora box of targeted advertising, and that should not happen. Another very important rule is data minimization, which means that only the data that is really necessary shall be used for this application. And the data should also be accurate, which means that accurate GPS location and also accurate when it comes to identity of the person. The data should not be stored longer than necessary. And of course, it doesn't have to state that it will be 14 days, because we don't know how much longer this crisis will last. But it can, within the terms and conditions of this application, it should be clearly stated that once the crisis is over, the data will be deleted and application securely dismantled. And of course, integrity and confidentiality of the data shall be ensured, which again highlights the importance of security measures. And again, a legal basis, which means that only the personal data can be processed only on specific legal basis, which can be consent or specific legal provision. Another very important concept that was created in Canada, then introduced to General Data Protection Regulation, is privacy by design. And it's a very good approach that should be applied for any application tracking COVID shall be applied. And this approach encourages that developers will take user-centric perspective, and basically privacy preserving settings will be set by default, which means that I don't have to change my settings, that the app will not track my location when it's not necessary, or app will not ask me to share my contacts if that is also not necessary for the purposes. And also this concept is highlighting again the transparency. Taking into account that application to fight COVID-19 will be dealing with health data, which is a special category of data, and of course it's dedicated for a large population. At least 60% of people should download it. It will constitute processing on a large scale of special categories of data, and that brings excuse me, the need of perform and data protection impact assessment. This is a formal review, and I would encourage that it will be formalized in written form afterwards. But in this assessment, there is a systematic description of the processing, which means that what the processing is about, what is the purpose, what is the data being processed. Also, assessment between the necessity and proportionality, which means that this is performed in order to verify that only the necessary data will be processed. And there is also proportionality between the data and the purpose. Because, for example, if suddenly the application wants my, let's say, the governmental identification number, that would be not necessary nor proportionally for the purpose. Also, assessment of the risks to the rights and freedoms of the individuals should be taken into account, because depending on the different data that will be used, there will be different expectations of the individual, and as long as everything is transparent, individuals should be able to, let's say, have the awareness at least of the risks and threats to its own freedoms and rights. And the most important part of this data protection impact assessment is our risk mitigation measures. And if, as a result of this data protection impact assessment, it will turn out that still the processing will be of high risk because the mitigation in place is not providing a real mitigation, then data protection authority shall be consulted in advance. And of course, in data protection impact assessment shall be involved data protection officer. But there is a magic trick, because privacy is focused on the protection of personal data. So if we are not dealing with any personal data, we don't have to worry about data protection rules. However, this is quite risky approach, because it's really difficult nowadays with all the technical solution to ensure full anonymization and ensure that there is really a very low risk of de-identification of individual. And pseudo-anonymization does not mean anonymization. So I would really recommend to at least follow privacy by design, even if there are no personal data per se involved in the application. As of course, COVID fight is a global challenge. Also, Computer Chaos Club issued some Corona apps recommendations. And again, this in those recommendations, anonymity is highlighted, lack of possibility to link the individual with the data. Also, it's highlighted the voluntary download of such application. I think we cannot force people to download the application. We need to have trust in our citizens. And those recommendations are also highlighting preservation on fundamental privacy. And I will talk briefly about India, where there are very limited privacy laws. And just within a few days of providing the app, there were more than 50 million users, which can be quite successful. However, the app is mandatory for all workers, for both private and public. I think that was the reason behind the success. However, the app used Bluetooth signals, GPS, and other data like name, birthday, and biometric information. And focusing on the case of India highlights the importance of having proper privacy laws in place and privacy measures, because the app was hacked and name of quarantined people, as well as with the GPS coordinates of their location and their office location was leaked, providing huge risk for their security, basically. Because of course, if someone is diagnosed with COVID, that provides a public backlash, and people are really experiencing hate and other very unpleasant issues. So as we are talking about, this is conference focused on open source, I selected some open source software examples that are designed to fight COVID-19. And I think civil society should, let's say, pressure the governments to select those open source softwares, as they are allowing to dedicate limited resources to other necessary research, and also they are allowing to reuse something that was already invented, improve it, and with collective effort ensure that its quality is even better. And as such example of privacy preserving open source solution is epidemic dosimeter based on DP3 contact traces, which is still work in progress. However, as COVID crisis is bringing a lot of issues, not only how to fight the COVID-19 itself, but also we are isolated, working from home. We are not seeing our friends, we are not seeing our families. So there is, for example, Game Together that allows to play in a group video call, or a metronome that allows to play together remotely. There was also European hackathon, and another the village solution was created that allows for intimate meetings with friends, family, and teachers. And this is, I think, the breaking news of today, that the emergency ventilator for that allows for COVID-19 fight will be licensed. The documents will be licensed under Creative Commons, and softwares will be licensed under Apache. And that brings me to the question, if not open source, then what? I think then there is a case of waste of public money. And in Italy, initially the government ordered a proprietary application. However, after public criticism, this application will be published under Mozilla license, which allows then again for being reused. In Poland, the government spent a lot of money for an application that initially was voluntarily, but then became obligatory. And as a measure to start the quarantine, individuals were obliged to send selfie together with geo metadata information. And I think that's a very good case for evaluation of data minimization. And Poland also is introducing another app that will help to to track the COVID-19 in, let's say, back to normal phase. However, this application will be under open source license. As we are coming back to normality, there are many questionable choices. Among them, I would like to highlight one case, specific case in Italy. In one of the kindergarten, children were provided with vibrating bracelets, and use of these bracelets is bringing a lot of security and privacy issues. First of all, who has access to the data, how the data is secured, and then what is really the purpose, because if the bracelets are provided to kids between 4 and 6 years old, and the nature of kids is to play, they will just come closer to make the bracelets vibrate. And I think the coming days will bring even more innovative solutions. But what really became number one within this COVID-19 crisis, and I think it's number one risk for organization, is phishing. Between 21st days of COVID-19 crisis, they were created 6,000 websites dedicated to COVID, some of them malicious. And of course, attacks have spiked over 600% since February. And of course, as COVID-19 is not recognizing any borders, neither are cyber criminals, and they are very, very creative, using, for example, governments type of emails, or civil society, the need of providing help to vulnerable groups or people, or providing the latest guidance or way to avoid coronavirus, which makes people that are working from home, they are more, let's say, fatigued, more prone to link any link and be a victim of a phishing. So I would urge that we'll be vigilant, and we will take time to reflect before opening any email. We will check carefully email address, because it's very common that, for example, name and surname will appear like someone from our organization, but if we will look carefully, we will see that the domain name is different, or there is some other difference that should raise a red flag. Another red flag is if there is any warning that is highlighting that you need to act now, that should raise your awareness. Of course, check for spelling. Those phishing emails are often very connected with spelling and grammatical errors. Remember to protect your device, not only your device, but also any applications that you are using, to update them on ongoing basis. And I think as we are still facing COVID-19, and we are using Zoom on this conference, and cyber criminals are very, very creative. There was also Zoom bombing, which was completely new, a new phenomenon just created during pandemic. So I think still new things new threats will appear. So we need to be vigilant, and I am now open for questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Magdalena. So, very interesting and urgent topic. So that is why we have quite a lot of questions, actually. I will start one by one. So, first question from Manuel Mazzara is about the threshold. It was at the beginning of the presentation, and the threshold is 60%. And sometimes it's said it could be 70%. So how this threshold is calculated actually?
Well, I didn't. There are different methods, and depending on the source, they are between 60 and 90%. But I think it's also the fact that the COVID-19 is highly infectious, so the risk of being infected is high. So the effectiveness of the application is based on the its presence within the population, but I can come back on that later. I encourage to contact me by email.
Oh, okay. Well, so next question also from him. Regarding the map world of data protection. So you mentioned the 4 categories, and the question I also interested in it. What's the criteria for these categories?
Well, in fact, there are 5 categories because the fifth is like lack of
yes.
protection. But basically, the criteria that is used is the regime, how strict the regulation is. And of course, if we compare, for example, GDPR and Canadian regulation. In fact, the Canadian regulation, which is also very varies from province to province, they have very high requirements. And for example, if you have a closer look to Russian privacy regulation, then the requirements are already a little bit lower. So this is the mark. And for example, in India, the security provided for privacy is even lower. So this is the strictness of the regulation itself is the criteria.
Okay. By the way, for India, I heard that mostly all this government interaction with government institutes based on biometric. So it could be probably quite good from the security perspective.
Yes, I mean, use of biometric data requires a very selective and conscious use of security measures. And for example, in China, biometric measures are also used. But we need to remember that in Europe, we have a little bit different setup, and what is, let's say, allowed and publicly present. For example, in China, there is really big brother solution, biometric solution that is able to recognize individual and then, for example, send a ticket for red crossing on the red light. So this will never happen, I hope, in Europe, thanks to we have completely different, let's say, legal environment, constitutional order, and I think also different concept of society per se. So there are many factors that are influencing on the privacy law. And if we have a look on the privacy regulation development, just 20 years ago, really, there were minimal requirements in Europe. It's just how taking into account that technology is growing rapidly, and 20 years ago, who had a phone? Who had no, we didn't have smartphones. Now everyone almost has a smartphone. Everyone has access to internet, 3 devices. So we are becoming really digital, and that brings another risk. And of course, any regulation cannot anticipate those risks, but at least can protect, set minimal standard of protection. And at the same time, I would like to highlight that the privacy regulation shall not be perceived as a blocker, as something that is preventing us to advance with or provide this public health solution. No, it's just like providing the requirements, recommendations, preservations that should be in place in order that anything that will be provided will be provided in secure manner. And for example, then we can just imagine situation that I am diagnosed with COVID, I use the application, the data is leaked, and my life is really ruined. My neighbors hate me, anyone in the internet hates me, I have no life, and then I'm even thinking about suicide, right? So it's not that this privacy is not relevant, because as well as society, as well as individual is relevant. So it's something that we need to look for balance and solutions.
Okay, yeah, I agree. So, one more question is from Anne Berkomp. So she asked that she said that she feels that due to all this situation in Europe, it was a rush in development of these things and to get things online, like we all know in online. So she thinks that it led to data protection and data privacy issues, so they being sidelined. And okay, let's assume that you agree with this. What we can do about it as a fact? So what we can do with these data protection and privacy issues for now?
I would say that the first step is to really encourage governments that those applications will be open source, which means that everyone can verify how secure it is. And this is really very dynamic environment, which means that something that is secure today does not mean that will be secure tomorrow. So that is something that we also need to take into account. And I think it's really unfortunate that different governments are spending so much money on different applications instead of focusing on one universal solution for the whole Europe, that I think then could be much safer than many different applications that are developed in different countries. So I think that was the initial idea. There was one consortium working on one privacy solutions, but then the consortium, like unity of the consortium was broken. Now there are two different groups, and I expect that there will be more, because of course it's not only data protection, not only public health, but we need to remember that behind all that is also politics. But I think that we as a society, we have the right to ask questions, to make the pressure on the governments to remind that we are not renouncing from privacy rights, just that government can provide quick fix to a problem.
Okay, yeah. So next question from Artem Kruglov, who is me actually. Yes, so my question was about these tracking tools and whether it's obligatory to install them. I understand that in some countries it's obligatory for everyone. What about Europe, and whether it's legal to force people to install such tools? And for example, whether it's legal to force those who infected install this tool?
Well, in Europe, and not only in Europe, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in this covenant, there are mentioned the measures that shall be met whenever any exceptions to democratic society are introduced. So it's not so that we really don't have democratic fair rules to introduce some exceptional measures. And in the first place, for example, in Poland, the application was made obligatory, but it was made on the law provision. So there was a special legal act that introduced this, and in line with Polish legal order, this is applicable. But the application that was obligatory was for the quarantine, which means that only for the people that were already diagnosed or suspected of having COVID-19. I think Amanda is ready. I don't know if we have any.
So yeah, wait for a moment for a few more questions. I think two, if it is possible. So Amanda, could we for now, yes, close sharing for a moment? Because one more question from Anne Berkomp. She asked, what can we do to prevent data protection from being ignored in the next emergency? So we understand we are already maybe trained and some protocols developed or in process now.
I think we need to remember in this public discussion that it's not public health or privacy, it's not emergency or privacy, that we have a flexible legal framework to accommodate any emergency and privacy as well.
Okay, and there are a couple of questions about which are linked or related to one another, about data transparency and usage of open source approach to it. So, is it the only way, is it the right way to go into open source to promote data transparency as one of GDPR principle, or there are maybe other ways to assure, to guarantee data transparency in software systems?
Well, I think the same rules apply to software development, whether they are proprietary software or it's open source. The case with open source is just then it can be verified by public, not only by developers. And I think that's the huge pro of open source instead of proprietary applications. And of course, that means that if we will face any similar crisis in a few years, we have already solutions that we can build on. We don't have to spend a lot of money, which is really necessary to find a vaccination instead of software.
Okay, well, Magdalena, thank you. Thank you for your talk. And we have a couple more questions in the chat. I don't know if you have a time, maybe I can send it via mail to answer them, and then we'll share them in our lunch room, in our group chat here. So now I think it's time for me to give a word to Giancarlo.